Welcome to the audiobook Insights for the Art of Logic, How to Make Sense in a World That Doesn't, written by Eugenia Cheng. Introduction. We live in a world that often feels like it is drowning in noise. Turn on the news, scroll through social media, or sit down for a family dinner where politics is mentioned, and you are likely to encounter profound, aggressive disagreement. It feels as though we are screaming across a widening chasm. One side shouts facts, the other shouts feelings. One side cites statistics, the other cites personal experience. And in the middle of this cacophony, actual understanding seems to be dying a slow public death. This is the context in which Eugenia Cheng invites us to pause. Cheng is a mathematician, a category expert, and a concert pianist. She lives her life in the abstract beauty of high-level mathematics, a realm where things are precise, provable, and ultimately satisfying. But she also lives in the real world, a world of Brexit, elections, inequality, and human messy emotions. She begins this journey by addressing a fundamental misconception, the idea that logic and emotions are sworn enemies. There is a pervasive cultural myth, perhaps popularized by characters like Mr. Spock or Sherlock Holmes, that to be logical is to be unfeeling, cold, and robotic. Conversely, we are told that to be emotional is to be irrational, hysterical, or weak. Cheng argues that this dichotomy is not only false, but dangerous. In this introduction, Cheng lays out her primary thesis. Logic is not a tool to destroy your opponent or to strip the humanity out of an argument. Rather, logic is a framework for understanding. It is a way to see the structure behind the chaos. She explains that mathematics is known as the study of abstractions. To do math, you strip away the messy details of the real world to study the pure relationships between things. For example, if you have two apples and two oranges, the mathematician stops caring about the fruit and focuses only on the concept of 1 plus 1 equals 2. The fruit is the detail, the equation is the structure. Cheng suggests we can apply this same powerful technique to our social and political lives. When we are arguing about something like healthcare or taxation or gender roles, we often get bogged down in the specific, messy details of specific anecdotes. Logic allows us to step back and look at the underlying structure of the argument. If we can agree on the structure, we might be able to pinpoint exactly where we disagree, rather than just shouting past one another. However, she is careful to note that logic has limits. This is a crucial admission for a mathematician to make right at the start. Logic can tell us if an argument is valid, meaning if the conclusion follows from the premises, but it cannot tell us if the premises are actually true. That is where human experience, evidence, and yes, emotion come into play. The author describes her own motivation for writing this book. She saw intelligent people, friends, colleagues, the public, unable to communicate. She saw logic being used as a weapon to bully people, known as mansplaining or pedantry, where someone corrects a minor technical error to dismiss a valid emotional point. Cheng wants to reclaim logic from the pedants. She wants to show that real logic is kind, it is empowering, it clarifies. She outlines the structure of what we are about to learn. The journey is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, the power of logic, will equip us with the tools of the trade, how to build arguments, how to spot contradictions, and how to use abstractions. Part 2, the limits of logic, will humble us. It will show us where logic fails, how paradoxes work, and why being technically right is often useless in human relationships. Finally, Part 3, beyond logic, will bring emotions back into the fold, showing how we combine rigorous thinking with empathy to actually change minds and move the world forward. This book is not just a manual on how to win debates. It is a manifesto for a more sane, compassionate, and thinking society. It asks us to be brave enough to examine our own beliefs as rigorously as we examine others. It asks us to use the sharp knife of logic not to wound, but to perform surgery, to cut away the confusion and reveal the truth underneath. So, let us begin. Part 1. The Power of Logic. Chapter 1. Why Logic? To understand why we need logic, we must first look at the state of our public discourse. Eugenia Cheng opens this chapter by observing a painful reality. We seem to have lost the ability to disagree productively. In the modern world, particularly online, arguments rarely look like an exchange of ideas. Instead, they resemble trench warfare. Two opposing sides dig in, launch aggressive statements at one another, and retreat deeper into their own bunkers. When we witness a political debate or a Facebook comment thread, we rarely see someone pause and say, that is a valid point. I had not considered that structure. Instead, we see insults, logical fallacies, and a complete breakdown of communication. Cheng argues that this is tragic because disagreement is actually a vital part of being human. Disagreement is how we refine our ideas, how we solve problems, and how we negotiate living together in a complex society. The problem is not that we disagree. The problem is how we disagree. This is where logic enters the room. Cheng defines logic in this context not as a set of dusty rules from a philosophy textbook, but as a practical tool for clarity. She draws a parallel to her life as a research mathematician. In mathematics, if you want to convince someone that a theorem is true, you cannot simply shout it louder than them. You cannot appeal to their emotions or bribe them. You must construct a proof. A proof is a series of logical steps that leads inevitably from a starting point to a conclusion. If the steps are solid, the conclusion is undeniable. The author suggests that while real life is messier than a math textbook, we can bring this same spirit of proof to our everyday arguments. The purpose of using logic in an argument is not to humiliate the other person into submission, it is to illuminate what is actually happening. When we apply logic, we are trying to uncover the skeleton of the argument. Imagine an argument as a body. The flesh and skin are the specific words we use, the tone of voice, the specific examples, and the emotional heat. Logic ignores the flesh and looks at the skeleton, the structural connections between the ideas. For example, consider a heated argument about tax policy. One person might be shouting about how taxation is theft, while the other is shouting about how taxation is the price of civilization. On the surface, they are just yelling. But if we use logic to X-ray this argument, we might find the underlying structures. Person A's structure might be, I believe that keeping what one earns is a fundamental right. Taxation takes what one earns. Therefore, taxation violates a fundamental right. Person B's structure might be, I believe that contributing to the common good is a fundamental duty. Taxation is the method of contributing. Therefore, taxation is a fundamental duty. Once logic helps us reveal these skeletons, we realize something profound. We are not actually arguing about the tax rate. We are arguing about a fundamental starting point, a core belief about rights versus duties. Logic helps us see that no amount of shouting statistics will solve this, because the disagreement is at the very base, the axiom. Cheng emphasizes that logic saves us time and energy. It prevents us from arguing about the wrong things. If we can see that our opponent's logic is actually sound, meaning their conclusion follows from their beliefs, but we simply hate their beliefs, then we can stop trying to find holes in their argument. We can accept that we have a fundamental difference of worldview. This brings a kind of peace. It turns a shouting match into a respectful recognition of difference. However, often the logic is not sound. Often people jump to conclusions that their own evidence does not support. Logic gives us the tools to gently point this out. Instead of saying, you are stupid, logic allows us to say, I see your starting point and I see your conclusion, but I think there's a missing step in the middle. Can you explain how you got from A to B? This approach transforms conflict. It turns an adversarial battle into a collaborative investigation. We become two people standing side by side, looking at the argument together, trying to see if it holds up. Cheng also addresses the fear that logic is elitist or difficult. She assures us that we all use logic every day, often without knowing it. When we decide what time to leave the house to catch a train, we are using logic. When we adjust a recipe because we are doubling the guests, we are using logic. We are naturally logical creatures. We just often let our emotions or our biases cloud that natural ability when the stakes feel high. Why logic? Because the world is awash in information and misinformation. We are constantly being bombarded by people trying to manipulate us, politicians, advertisers, pundits. Logic is our self-defense. It is the filter that allows us to let the truth in and keep the nonsense out. It empowers us to think for ourselves, rather than just accepting whatever the loudest voice in the room is screaming. But to use this tool effectively, we must understand what it actually is and what it is not. We must move beyond the colloquial idea of logic and understand its formal power. That is the task of the next chapter. Chapter 2. What logic is. If we are going to use logic to save our conversations, we first have to clear up a massive misunderstanding. In casual conversation, we often use the word logical to mean correct or sensible. If someone suggests we bring an umbrella because it looks like rain, we say, that's logical. But Eugenia Cheng needs us to understand that in the rigorous world of mathematics and philosophy, logic is something much more specific. Logic is not about truth, at least not directly. Logic is about validity. This distinction is the heartbeat of the entire book, so let's slow down and dismantle it. Cheng explains that an argument is a journey. You start at a beginning point, which we call the premise. You apply a set of rules, and you arrive at a destination, which we call the conclusion. Logic is strictly the study of the rules of the journey. It ensures that if your starting point is true, your destination must also be true. However, and this is the crucial twist, logic does not care if your starting point is actually true in the real world. To illustrate this, Cheng uses a classic style of example. Consider this argument. Premise 1, all penguins are purple. Premise 2, Boris is a penguin. Conclusion, therefore, Boris is purple. Is this argument true? No, because penguins are not purple. But is it logical? Yes, it is perfectly logical. The structure is flawless. If it were true that all penguins were purple, and if it were true that Boris was a penguin, then it would be inescapable that Boris is purple. This argument is what mathematicians call valid. It has a perfect structural integrity, but it is not sound. A sound argument is the holy grail. It is an argument that is both logically valid and built on true premises. Why does this distinction matter? Cheng argues that most human disagreements fail because we confuse these two things. We attack someone's logic when we should be attacking their premises.
Or we attack their premises when their logic is actually broken. If you want to disagree with the purple penguin argument, you cannot say your logic is bad. The logic is perfect. You must say your logic is valid, but your premise is false. This brings us to the superpower of logic, abstraction. Cheng explains that logic is the art of stripping away details. Real life is complicated, colorful, and noisy, like a high-resolution photograph. Logic is like a line drawing or a blueprint of that photograph. We throw away the color, the texture, and the noise so that we can see the shapes. She uses the analogy of the London Underground map. If you have ever looked at a subway map, you know it does not represent reality. It shows the lines as straight, orderly, and evenly spaced. In reality, the tunnels curve, twist, and vary wildly in length. If you tried to use a subway map to walk through the streets of London above ground, you would get lost immediately. But for the specific purpose of navigating the train system, the map is perfect. It ignores the messy geographical reality to focus purely on the connections, how to get from station A to station B. Logic is the subway map of thought. It ignores the messy emotional details of an issue to focus purely on the connections between ideas. Cheng warns us that we must be careful with this power. If we abstract too much, we lose touch with reality. If we treat the subway map as the actual city, we make mistakes. This is where mansplaining or cold rationality often goes wrong. It treats human problems as abstract math problems and forgets that the details being stripped away are actual people's feelings and lives. So what is logic? It is a framework for constructing rigorous arguments. It is a way of saying, I am not asking you to agree with my starting assumptions yet. I am just asking you to agree that if I start here, I must end there. When we understand this, we stop trying to win every part of the argument at once. We can say to an opponent, okay, your logic is valid. I can see how you reached that conclusion. Now let's go back to the start and discuss your premises. This definition transforms logic from a weapon of dominance into a tool for structured exploration. But even with a perfect map, we can still go the wrong way. In the next chapter, we will look at one of the most common ways people misread the map, the direction of travel. Chapter 3, the directionality of logic. One of the most frequent and dangerous mistakes human beings make is confusing the direction of an arrow. In the physical world, arrows are simple. If a sign points to the left, you go left. But in the world of ideas, the arrow of logic, the connection that says this leads to that, is often misread, leading to catastrophic misunderstandings, social prejudice, and broken arguments. Eugenia Cheng dedicates this chapter to the concept of implication. In formal logic, this is often written as if A, then B. We understand this intuitively in simple contexts. Consider the statement, if you are in the shower, you are getting wet. Here, A is being in the shower and B is getting wet. The arrow goes from A to B. It is a one-way street. The problem arises when we subconsciously try to drive the wrong way down that street. We assume that because A implies B, then B must imply A. We think if you are getting wet, you must be in the shower. Obviously, this is false. You could be in the rain. You could be swimming. You could have just been splashed by a passing car. Cheng calls this the error of the converse. The converse is what you get when you swap the A and the B. Original, if A, then B. True. Converse, if B, then A. Not necessarily true. This sounds like a trivial classroom puzzle until we apply it to social issues.
Cheng shows how this logical error is the mathematical root of stereotyping. Consider a painful real-world example. Statement: if a person is a violent fundamentalist extremist, they are likely to be religious. Let's accept this premise for the sake of the logical exercise. A equals violent extremist, B equals religious. The arrow goes A/B. The error happens when society flips the arrow. People look at a religious person, B, and subconsciously assume they are an extremist, A. They have confused the characteristic of the subset with the characteristic of the whole group. They have assumed that because the extremists are in the religious group consists of extremists. Logic acts as a shield against this prejudice by forcing us to check the direction of the arrow. Cheng also introduces us to the inverse. This is another false step. Original: if you are in the shower, you are wet. Inverse: if you are not in the shower, you are not wet. Again, false. You can be wet without being in the shower. In arguments, we see this all the time. If you work hard, you will succeed. People wrongly assume this means if you didn't succeed, you didn't work hard. This is a cruel logical fallacy that ignores luck, systemic barriers, and privilege. Logic protects us from blaming the victim by showing us that the arrow doesn't work that way. However, there is one manipulation that is valid. It is called the contrapositive. If you take the statement, if A, then B, and you flip both sides and negate both sides, you get a true statement. Original: if you are in the shower, you are wet. Contrapositive: if you are not wet, then you are not in the shower. This is logically airtight. If wetness is a necessary result of the shower, then the absence of wetness proves the absence of the shower. Cheng urges us to use these tools, implication, converse, inverse, and contrapositive, to audit the news we hear and the thoughts we think. When someone makes a broad claim, ask yourself, which way does the arrow point? Are they assuming that because all X are Y, that all Y are X? Finally, she touches on the rare and beautiful case where the arrow goes both ways. This is called equivalence, or if and only if. If it is Saturday, it is the weekend, assuming a standard work week. If it is the weekend, it is Saturday. Wait, that's false. It could be Sunday. So this is not an equivalence. A true equivalence is rare. If you are an unmarried male, you are a bachelor. If you are a bachelor, you are an unmarried male. This works both ways. The definitions are identical. Cheng warns us that true equivalence is hard to find in the messy real world. Most relationships are one-way streets, implications, not two-way streets, equivalences. Recognizing this distinction allows us to be more precise, more fair, and less prone to jumping to false conclusions. Part 1. The Power of Logic. Chapter 4. Opposites and Falsehoods. We have explored the direction of the arrow. Now, Eugenia Cheng invites us to explore what happens when we try to break the arrow or reverse the world entirely. We are entering the realm of negation. On the surface, opposites seem like the easiest concept in the world. We learn them in kindergarten: up and down, hot and cold, light and dark. It feels intuitive. But Cheng argues that this kindergarten intuition is actually a major liability in adult reasoning. In the complex world of logic and human relationships, finding the true opposite of a statement is surprisingly difficult, and getting it wrong is a recipe for extremism. The fundamental error we make is assuming that the world is binary, a switch that is either on or off. We assume that if something is not good, it must be bad. If someone is not with us, they must be against us. Cheng uses the precision of logic to dismantle this black and white thinking. In logic, the negation of a statement is simply everything that is not that statement. It covers the entire remaining universe of possibilities, which is often a vast gray spectrum. Consider the statement, I love you. If we ask an emotional human for the opposite, they will likely say, I hate you. But logic says this is incorrect. The negation of I love you is simply I do not love you. I do not love you does not necessarily imply hatred. It could mean I like you. It could mean I am indifferent to you. It could mean I barely know you. It could mean I am annoyed by you but still care. The not covers all these options. Hate is just one extreme point on the spectrum of not love. When we confuse the logical negation, not love, with the polar opposite, hate, we create false dichotomies. This is why political discourse is so toxic. If you say, I am not fully in favor of this specific immigration policy, the opposing side might hear, I hate immigrants. You expressed a not, but they heard the polar opposite. Logic teaches us to inhabit the middle ground, the vast space of not X that is not necessarily anti-X. Cheng then introduces us to a slightly more technical yet incredibly useful tool, De Morgan's laws. These are the rules for how to find the opposite of combinations, statements involving and or. Imagine a politician says, I will lower taxes and I will improve healthcare. How do we call them a liar? What is the opposite of that promise? Our instinct might be to flip both sides. You will not lower taxes and you will not improve healthcare. But De Morgan's laws tell us this is too strong. To prove the politician false, they don't have to fail at both things, they only have to fail at one. The negation of A and B is not A or not B. If they lower taxes but ruin healthcare, they broke the promise. If they improve healthcare but raise taxes, they broke the promise. This teaches us that and statements are very fragile. They are easy to break. Conversely, consider an or statement. I will buy you a bike or a car. To prove this person is lying, it is not enough to show they didn't buy the car. Maybe they bought the bike. You have to show they didn't buy the bike and they didn't buy the car. The negation of A or B is not A and not B. This teaches us that or statements are very robust. They are hard to disprove because the person has so many outs. Finally, Cheng addresses the logic of all and some. This is where the most common social arguments fall apart. What is the opposite of all politicians are corrupt? The tempting answer is no politicians are corrupt, but that is the polar opposite, not the logical negation. The logical negation of all is simply not all. To disprove all politicians are corrupt, you do not need to prove that every politician is a saint. You only need to find one honest politician, just one. That single counterexample shatters the all. This is liberating. It means we don't have to defend an entire group to stop a stereotype. If someone says men are aggressive, you don't have to prove men are peaceful. You just have to say, here is one man, Frank, who is gentle. The all is broken. The reverse is also true. The opposite of there are some honest politicians is there are no honest politicians. To disprove a some statement is very hard. You have to search the entire universe and come up empty. Cheng closes this chapter by reminding us that the world is rarely black and white. Between the black of all and the white of none lies the vast, colorful gray reality of some. Logic is the tool that forces us to stop jumping to the extremes and start acknowledging the complex middle, the place where real life actually happens. Chapter 5. Blame and Responsibility. We have arrived at one of the most emotionally charged applications of logic, the assignment of blame. In our personal lives and our public politics, we are obsessed with finding the bad guy. When something goes wrong, whether it is a car accident, a failed marriage, or a national economic crisis, our first instinct is to ask, whose fault is it? Eugenia Cheng argues that this question, while human, is often logically illiterate. It treats causality as a single arrow pointing from one villain to one victim. But as we've learned, logic is rarely a straight line. Logic suggests that causality is more like a tree or a complex network. To navigate this, Cheng introduces two of the most powerful concepts in the logician's toolkit: necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. Understanding the difference between these two can completely change how we solve problems. A necessary condition is something that must happen for an event to occur. For example, having fuel is a necessary condition for your car to start. If you have no fuel, the car will definitely not start. However, having fuel is not enough on its own. You also need a working battery, a key, and an engine. Fuel is necessary, but not sufficient. A sufficient condition is something that guarantees the result. If you drop your car into a crusher, that is sufficient to stop it from working. You don't need anything else. Cheng applies this to our arguments about blame. We often confuse the two. We look for the one factor that is sufficient to cause the problem, so we can blame it. But often, disasters happen because of a convergence of many necessary conditions. Consider a house fire. Was it caused by the lit match? Yes. Was it caused by the presence of oxygen? Yes. Was it caused by the flammable curtains? Yes. If you remove the match, no fire. If you remove the oxygen, no fire. If you remove the curtains, maybe no fire. Logically, all three are partial causes.
But when we assign blame, we don't blame the oxygen. We blame the person who dropped the match. Why? Because the oxygen is a background constant, while the match was an active variable. Cheng warns that in social issues, this match versus oxygen distinction becomes dangerous. It allows us to ignore systemic problems, the oxygen, and focus only on individual actors, the match. For instance, consider the debate around crime. One side might say, the cause of crime is the criminal's bad choice, the match. The other side might say, the cause of crime is poverty and lack of education, the oxygen, fuel. Logic tells us, stop fighting. Both are likely true. The criminal's choice was a necessary link in the chain, but the environment was a necessary condition that made the choice likely. If we want to solve the problem rather than just feel self-righteous, we need to look at the entire causal tree. We need to ask, which necessary conditions can we most easily remove? We cannot easily remove human free will, the choice, but we might be able to remove the poverty, the fuel. By shifting from who is to blame, a moral question, to what were the necessary conditions, a logical question, we move from shaming people to fixing systems. Cheng also touches on the concept of the contrapositive again in this context. If A implies B, then not B implies not A. If poverty implies higher crime, this does not mean rich people never commit crime. It means that if we want to lower crime, not B, we should look at alleviating poverty, not A, as one lever we can pull. This chapter asks us to be less like prosecutors seeking a conviction and more like air crash investigators. When a plane crashes, investigators don't just blame the pilot. They look at the weather, the mechanical maintenance, the software, and the fatigue levels. They look for every necessary condition that aligned to cause the tragedy.
They don't care about fault. They care about preventing the next crash. Cheng invites us to treat our disagreements and social failures with that same rigorous, non-judgmental curiosity. We must stop looking for the one bad apple and start looking at the barrel, the tree, and the soil.
Chapter 6, Relationships. We have talked about arrows, opposites, and blame. Now Eugenia Cheng wants us to talk about boxes. Human beings are categorizing machines. To make sense of the infinite complexity of the world, we put things into mental boxes. We have a box for fruit, a box for furniture, a box for friends, and a box for enemies. In mathematics, this act of sorting is called set theory, and it is the foundational language of relationships. Cheng argues that a vast amount of political and social conflict arises simply because we are bad at visualizing how these boxes relate to one another. We mess up the geometry of our ideas. To understand this, we have to visualize the three fundamental ways that categories can interact: subsets, intersections, and unions. First, let us look at the subset. This is the Russian doll relationship. Imagine a big box labeled rectangles. Inside that box, there is a smaller box labeled squares. Every single square is a rectangle. If you are in the small box, you are automatically in the big box. But, and this is critical, not every rectangle is a square. If you are in the big box, you might be outside the small one. This seems obvious in geometry, but we fail at it constantly in society. Consider the word privilege. Let's imagine a big box labeled people who benefit from white privilege. Inside that box, there is a smaller box labeled rich white people. If you are in the small box, you are definitely in the big box. But if you are in the big box, if you are white, you might not be in the small box. You might be poor. You might be struggling. When a poor white person hears the phrase white privilege, they often feel insulted. They look at their own life, which is hard, and say, I'm not privileged, I'm struggling. Logically, they are making a subset error. They think privilege means wealthy and easy life. They think the big box is the small box. Cheng explains that logic allows us to be precise.
We can say, you possess a specific attribute, whiteness, that shields you from specific systemic barriers, even if you are suffering in other ways. Logic allows us to separate the attribute from the whole existence. Next, we have the intersection. This is the Venn diagram relationship. Imagine two circles that overlap. One circle is women, the other circle is Black people. The intersection is the football-shaped wedge in the middle, Black women. Cheng invokes the concept of intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Logic proves why this concept is mathematically necessary. If you only study the circle of women, you might focus on issues that affect mostly white women, like the glass ceiling in corporate jobs. If you only study the circle of Black people, you might focus on issues that affect mostly Black men, like police brutality. The people in the intersection, Black women, can fall through the cracks of your logic. They experience a unique combination of forces that neither parent group fully explains. Logic tells us that the properties of the intersection are not just the sum of the parts. They are a unique set. If we don't look at the intersection specifically, we are logically incomplete. Finally, we have the union. This is the big Kent. This is when we glue two sets together. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, the union is A or B. The logical danger here is false unification. We often group things together that don't belong simply because they share one trait. For example, the left or the right. These are massive unions. The right contains libertarians who want small government and social conservatives who might want government to enforce morality. Logically, these two groups are very different, sometimes opposite. But because they are in the same political union, we treat them as a monolith. Cheng warns us against the straw man tactic, which relies on abusing these relationships. A straw man argument often works like this. Find a crazy person in the union of your opponent's party. Pretend that this crazy person represents the intersection of all their beliefs. Attack the whole group based on that one subset. If you find one vegan who is rude and you say vegans are aggressive, you are treating a tiny subset as if it were the whole set. You are logically hallucinating. This chapter is a plea for granularity. Don't just look at the label on the big box. Look inside. Ask, is this a subset? Is this an intersection? Are we talking about all of them or just some of them? By mapping out these relationships, we stop fighting against imaginary enemies and start seeing the nuanced reality of the people standing in front of us.
Chapter 7. How to be right. We have reached the conclusion of Part 1. We have gathered our tools, the arrows of implication, the boundaries of sets, the precision of negation, and the trees of causality. Now, Eugenia Cheng asks us to put them all together. She wants to teach us how to construct an argument that is actually right. But first, we must confront a difficult truth about the English language. When we say someone is right, we usually mean two different things simultaneously. We mean that their conclusion is true in the real world, and we mean that their reasoning was correct. Logic demands that we rip these two things apart. As we touched on earlier, an argument can be valid, good reasoning, without being sound, true conclusion. In this chapter, Cheng provides the blueprint for ensuring our arguments are both. To be right in the fullest sense, you must satisfy two distinct burdens of proof. Burden number 1, logical validity. This is the internal skeleton of your argument. You must show that there is no possible world in which your premises are true, but your conclusion is false. The arrow must fly straight. Cheng advises us to check our validity by trying to break it. Look for counterexamples. If you argue, exercise is good for you, therefore you should run a marathon, search for the gap. Is it possible that exercise is good, but running a marathon is bad? Yes. A marathon might be too extreme for a person with a heart condition. The gap exists. The logic is invalid. To fix it, you must narrow the claim or add a bridge. Exercise is good. Running a marathon is a form of exercise. If you are healthy enough for extreme exertion, then running a marathon is good for you. Now the gap is closed. The logic is valid. Burden number 2, factual truth. This is the foundation. Once you have built a valid logical structure, you have to prove that the starting blocks, the premises, are actually true.
This is where logic hands the baton to science, history, and observation. Logic cannot prove that the sky is blue. You just have to look up. Cheng points out that most arguments fail because people try to use logic to prove facts, or facts to prove logic. You cannot shout statistics to bridge a logical gap, and you cannot use a syllogism to prove a statistic. So how do we use this to be right in a disagreement? Cheng suggests a diagnostic method, almost like a mechanic fixing a car. When someone disagrees with you or you disagree with them, stop shouting. Instead, perform a logic check. Step 1. Locate the disagreement. Is the disagreement about the facts, the premise, or the reasoning, the logic? If you are arguing about whether the Earth is flat, that is a fact disagreement. Logic won't help much there. You need evidence. But if you are arguing about whether a tax cut will stimulate the economy, you might be arguing about the logic, the chain of cause and effect. Step 2. Isolate the logic. Strip away the emotion and write down the steps. If A happens, then B will happen. Does B really follow A, or is there a hidden step we forgot? Cheng notes that we often hide our weakest assumptions. We say, he's a politician, so he's a liar. The hidden step is, all politicians are liars. By exposing that hidden step, we can examine it. Is it true that all politicians are liars? No, we just found the weak point. Step 3. Build a bridge. If you find a gap in the logic, don't just destroy the argument. Help the other person fix it. This is the most masterclass insight of the chapter. Cheng argues that being right isn't about destroying your opponent, it's about constructing a truth together. If someone says, I don't like immigrants because they take jobs, and you scream racist, you have ended the conversation. If you use logic, you can say, okay, your premise is that there is a fixed number of jobs, the lump of labor fallacy.
If that were true, your conclusion would be right. But economists suggest that immigrants also create demand, which creates new jobs. So the premise of a fixed pie might be where we disagree. If that were true, your conclusion would be right. But economists suggest that immigrants also create demand, which creates new jobs. So the premise of a fixed pie might be where we disagree. We have mastered the power of logic. Now we must face the limits of logic. We are about to step off the sturdy pavement of mathematics and into the quicksand of the real world.
Part 2. The Limits of Logic. Chapter 8. Truth and Humans. We have spent the first half of this book building a magnificent machine. We have learned how to construct arguments that are bulletproof, arrows that fly straight, and categories that are watertight. We feel powerful. We feel ready to win. And now, Eugenia Cheng gently takes us by the shoulders and says, it's not enough. Welcome to the limitations of the system. In this chapter, Cheng explores the gap between logical truth and human truth. In the world of mathematics, if you prove something is true, it stays true forever. The Pythagorean theorem has not changed in 2,000 years. It doesn't matter if you are happy or sad, or if you live in Greece or China. It is objectively, eternally true. But in the human world, truth is a fluid, living thing. Cheng argues that logical validity is a necessary condition for truth, but it is not a sufficient one. Why? Because humans do not experience the world through syllogisms. We experience the world through belief. Cheng introduces us to the uncomfortable reality that logic cannot force someone to believe a premise. You can prove with perfect logic that if you want to save money, you should stop buying coffee. But if the person's fundamental premise is, my happiness depends on this morning ritual, your logic bounces off them. You are arguing about money. They are living a truth about happiness.
This brings us to the difference between scientific truth and emotional truth. Scientific truth is established by evidence and repetition. Emotional truth is established by experience and feeling. Cheng warns that we often try to use logic to crush emotional truth, and it backfires. Imagine a person who is afraid of flying. You can show them the statistics. You can use logic. Premise 1, planes are safer than cars. Premise 2, you drive a car every day. Conclusion, you should not be afraid of the plane. Logically, you are right. But the person is still shaking in their seat. Why? Because their fear is not a logical proposition. It is a visceral, biological reality. By hitting them with logic, you are not helping. You are just telling them that their feelings are wrong, which makes them feel stupid and defensive. Cheng suggests that to really communicate, we must respect the axioms of others, a concept she will explore deeper later. But for now, the lesson is about humility. We must accept that logic is a tool for processing information, not a tool for generating fundamental values. Logic can tell you how to get to the moon, but it cannot tell you why you should go. Logic can tell you how to distribute wealth efficiently, but it cannot tell you that fairness is better than greed. Those whys, those core values, come from being human, not from being logical. Furthermore, Cheng points out that humans are prone to logical gaps. We often believe things that are not fully proven, and that is actually okay. If we waited for a mathematical proof before we made any decision, we would never get out of bed. We use heuristics, intuition, and trust. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a feature of survival. We have to act on incomplete information. The danger arises when we pretend our intuitive beliefs are logical proofs. This is where fake news and conspiracy theories thrive. They mimic the shape of logic. They use the language of evidence and connection, but they are built on the sand of fear and bias. Cheng closes this chapter by redefining our goal. The goal is not to replace our humanity with logic. The goal is to use logic to guard our humanity. We use logic to check our biases, to slow down our knee-jerk reactions, and to understand where our feelings are coming from. But we do not use it to delete the feelings themselves. We are logical creatures, yes, but we are biological creatures first.
And as we will see in the next chapter, even the pure system of logic itself has cracks in the foundation. We are about to enter the hall of mirrors known as paradoxes.
Chapter 9, Paradoxes. We usually think of logic as a solid bedrock, a place where things are either true or false, black or white. But Eugenia Cheng now takes us to the edge of that bedrock, where the ground crumbles away into a bottomless pit. This is the world of paradoxes. A paradox is not just a difficult problem. It is a situation where logic actually eats itself. It is a place where following the rules perfectly leads you to a contradiction. Cheng starts with the most famous example in history, the liar's paradox. Imagine a man walks up to you and says, "This sentence is false." Let's apply logic to that statement. If the statement is true, then the sentence is false, so it's false. But if the statement is false, then the sentence is true, so it's true. We are trapped in an infinite loop. True leads to false, false leads to true. The computer in our brain freezes. This seems like a silly party trick, but Cheng explains that it reveals a devastating flaw in the system of classical logic. It shows that logic cannot handle self-reference very well. When a system tries to talk about itself, it often breaks. She then introduces us to a more human version of this, known as Russell's paradox, illustrated by the barber of Seville. Here's the rule. There is a barber in a town who shaves all the men and only the men who do not shave themselves. The question is, who shaves the barber? Let's look at the logic. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves. But the rule says he does not shave that group, so he can't shave himself. Okay, so if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves. But the rule says he must shave that group, so he must shave himself. Again, we are stuck. There is no logical answer. The definition of the barber is logically impossible. Why does Cheng bring this up? Is it just to make our heads hurt? No. She wants to show us that logic is not omnipotent. There are boundaries to what it can resolve. In the early 20th century, mathematicians tried to build a perfect system where everything could be proven. Then Kurt Gödel came along and used these kinds of paradoxes to prove that it was impossible. He showed that in any complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven by the system itself. This is a humbling moment for the rationalist. It means we can never fully explain the universe using only logic. There will always be gaps. Cheng also touches on Zeno's paradox, the famous story of Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. By the time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a little bit. By the time Achilles covers that new distance, the tortoise has moved a tiny bit more. Logically, it seems Achilles can never catch the tortoise because there are infinite distinct steps to take. But in reality, we know Achilles catches the tortoise easily. Logic said never. Reality said now. Cheng explains that this paradox was eventually solved not by logic, but by mathematics, specifically the invention of calculus and the concept of limits. We learned that you can add up an infinite number of tiny things and get a finite result. The lesson here is profound. Sometimes when logic says this is impossible, logic is wrong. Sometimes our logical model is too rigid for the fluid reality of the world. When we encounter a paradox in our own lives, like the paradox of tolerant intolerance, should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? We shouldn't try to solve it with simple true-false logic. We have to recognize that we have hit the limit of the system. We need a better tool. We need to step outside the loop. Paradoxes teach us that the world is not a clean binary code. It is a place where things can be messy, self-referential, and seemingly contradictory, yet still exist. Logic helps us find the paradox, but it cannot always fix it.
Chapter 10, Where Logic Can't Help Us. We have seen logic collapse into paradoxes. Now, Eugenia Cheng asks us to look at the vast territories of human existence where logic simply does not apply. It is like trying to use a hammer to paint a sunset. The tool is excellent, but it is the wrong tool for the job. The first and most important limit of logic is the infinite why. Cheng compares this to the game played by toddlers. You tell a child, eat your vegetables. They ask, why? You say, because they are healthy. Why? Because you need vitamins to grow. Why? Because biology. Why? Eventually, every parent reaches a breaking point. They shout, because I said so, or that's just the way it is. Cheng explains that this is not a parenting failure, it is a logical necessity. Logic is a process of justification. You justify B by pointing to A. You justify A by pointing to Z. But you cannot go back forever. Eventually, you hit bedrock, a statement that has no justification behind it, a statement that you simply believe because you believe it. Logic cannot help us choose these starting points. Logic can tell you, if you want to be safe, you should lock the door. But logic cannot tell you that being safe is better than living dangerously. That is a value judgment. This brings us to the famous philosophical concept known as Hume's guillotine, or the is-ought problem. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, pointed out that you can pile up as many facts as you want, is statements, but you can never use them to logically prove a moral duty, an ought statement. Fact, this poison will kill a man. Is, conclusion, therefore you ought not to poison him. Ought. Wait, logic says that gap is invalid. The conclusion only follows if you add a hidden premise. You ought not to kill people. But where did that premise come from? Science didn't prove it. Math didn't prove it. Logic didn't prove it. It came from empathy. It came from morality.
It came from the human heart.
Cheng argues that many of our fiercest arguments happen because we try to use logic to crush someone's values. We treat a moral disagreement as a factual error, but you cannot logically prove someone is wrong for liking vanilla ice cream more than chocolate. And you often cannot logically prove someone is wrong for prioritizing freedom over security or tradition over progress. Those are oughts, not ises. Another area where logic struggles is the future. Logic relies on truth values. It is raining is either true or false, but it will rain tomorrow is neither true nor false yet. It is a probability. Logic struggles with uncertainty. We can use statistics, which is math, but the strict if-then structures of logic get very shaky when the if is a maybe. We have to become comfortable with risk, which is an emotional calculation, not just a logical one. Finally, logic fails in the gray areas. Logic loves sharp boundaries. It loves sets, like we discussed earlier. You are either in the box or out of the box. But real life is full of things that defy boxes. Cheng uses the Sorites paradox, or the paradox of the heap. One grain of sand is not a heap. Two grains are not a heap. If you have a non-heap and add one grain, it is still a non-heap. Logically, you can keep adding grains forever and never have a heap. But clearly, at some point, you have a heap. Logic cannot tell you exactly which grain of sand turned it into a heap. The boundary is fuzzy. This applies to words like rich, old, smart, or democratic. At what exact dollar amount does a person become rich? Logic demands a number. Reality offers a gradient. When we try to force these fuzzy concepts into strict logical boxes, we end up with silly arguments. He's not really bald, he has hair on the sides. Cheng concludes this chapter by reassuring us. The fact that logic has limits is not a bad thing. It just means we need other ways of knowing. We need intuition, we need emotion, we need faith.
We need art. Logic is the skeleton of our understanding. It holds us upright. But a skeleton without flesh is a monster. We need the flesh of humanity to make the logic alive. This realization that our starting points are unprovable leads us directly into part 3. We are going to stop debating the logic and start examining the bedrock. We are going to talk about axioms. Part 3, Beyond Logic. Chapter 11, Axioms. We have now crossed the threshold into the final and perhaps most vital part of our journey. We are leaving the pure machinery of logic behind and entering the realm of beliefs. Eugenia Cheng opens this chapter with a term borrowed from ancient Greece, axioms. In mathematics, specifically in Euclid's geometry, an axiom is a starting rule. It is something we accept as true without proof, simply because we have to start somewhere. For example, Euclid said, "You can draw a straight line between any 2 points." He didn't prove it. He just said, "Let's agree this is true." From that simple starting point, he built the entire universe of geometry that we still use today. Cheng argues that human beings operate exactly the same way. We all have axioms, though we usually call them core beliefs or values. The central problem in our disagreements is that we think we are debating logic when we are actually clashing over axioms. Recall the infinite why game from the previous chapter. When you peel back the layers of someone's argument, asking why over and over, you eventually hit bedrock. You hit a statement that the person cannot justify with facts or logic. They simply feel it. I believe that individual freedom is the most important thing. I believe that reducing suffering is the most important thing. These are axioms. And here is the hard truth. You cannot use logic to change an axiom. If you are arguing with someone who has different axioms than you, logic is useless. It is like playing chess with someone who is playing checkers.
You are moving pieces according to different rules. You can shout checkmate all you want, but if they are playing checkers, it means nothing to them. Cheng uses the example of the debate over government assistance. Person A might have the axiom, people should be self-reliant. Suffering teaches resilience. Person B might have the axiom, society should protect the vulnerable. Suffering is a failure of the system. If person A and person B argue about tax rates, they will never agree. Person A will use logic to show how taxes hurt self-reliance. Person B will use logic to show how taxes help the vulnerable. Both arguments are logically valid. Both arrows fly straight, but they are flying toward different targets. The moment you realize this, the screaming stops. You realize that the other person is not stupid or illogical. They are simply building a different geometry based on different starting rules. Cheng suggests that the goal of a deep conversation should not be to win, but to uncover these axioms. We should act like archaeologists. We should gently brush away the surface arguments to find the buried foundation. Instead of attacking their conclusion, ask, what is the core belief that leads you to that? Once you find it, you can say, I see. You prioritize X and I prioritize Y. That is why we disagree.
This does not solve the disagreement, but it changes the nature of it. It moves us from thinking, you are wrong,
to thinking we are different. However, Cheng also warns us that we must be honest about our own axioms. We often pretend our beliefs are facts derived from nature. We say, it is just natural that men do X and women do Y. Logic demands we admit, no, that is not a fact. That is an axiom I have chosen to accept. By acknowledging that our deepest beliefs are choices, unprovable assumptions, we become more humble. We realize that our worldview is just one logical system among many. It might be a good system, it might be a moral system, but it is not the only logically valid system. This leads us to a fascinating question. If axioms are just black and white starting points, how do we deal with the messy real world where nothing is black and white? That is the subject of the next chapter. Part 3, Beyond Logic. Chapter 12, Fine Lines and Gray Areas. Eugenia Cheng has shown us that logic relies on clear categories. A statement is true or false. A number is even or odd. You are in the box or out of the box. Logic is a world of sharp edges and high contrast. But as we look out the window, we see a world that is painted in watercolors. The real world is full of gradients, spectrums, and fuzzy transitions. This mismatch between the sharpness of logic and the blurriness of life is responsible for some of our most exhausting arguments. Cheng revisits the Sorites paradox, the paradox of the heap, to explore this deeper. Imagine we are trying to define the word bald. A man with 0 hairs is bald. That is clear. If a man is bald, adding one single hair does not make him not bald. Therefore, a man with 1 hair is bald. If we keep applying this logic, that 1 hair makes no difference, we eventually conclude that a man with 10,000 hairs is bald. Obviously, this is false.
Somewhere between 0 hairs and 10,000 hairs, the word bald stopped applying, but logic cannot find the exact line. This problem plagues us in almost every social debate. Consider the word rich. Politicians argue about taxing the rich, but who is that? Is it someone with $1 million? If so, what about the person with $999,999? Are they poor? The difference is $1, a trivial amount. Yet in a binary logical system, one is in the tax bracket, the set of rich, and one is out. Cheng explains that this is the problem of discretization. We are trying to impose a discrete, step-by-step, grid onto a continuous, smooth reality. Logic demands a sharp line, the law of the excluded middle. You are either A or not A. Reality offers a smooth slope. So how do we solve this? We cannot fix reality, so we have to fix our logic. Cheng argues that we solve this by making a choice. We draw a line. We decide, arbitrarily, that the voting age is 18. Is an 18-year-old biologically different from a 17-year-old and 364-day-old? No, the line is fake. It is artificial. But we need the line for society to function. We need a binary switch for the law. Can you vote? Yes or no. The mistake we make in arguments is forgetting that we drew the line ourselves. We act as if the line exists in nature. We argue he is an adult, so he is mature. The premise he is an adult is a legal fiction based on a birthday. It is not a biological fact about maturity. Cheng urges us to be gray area literate. When we are debating topics like sexual harassment or racism or freedom of speech, we are often debating where the line is. One person says, that joke was offensive. The other says, no, it was just edgy. They are fighting over the fuzzy middle. Logic cannot solve this. There is no mathematical formula for offensive. Instead of trying to prove the other person wrong logically, we should acknowledge we are standing on a slope.
We can say, I draw my line here because I prioritize safety. The other person says, I draw my line there because I prioritize expression. We are back to axioms. The definition of the word is not a truth to be discovered, it is a boundary to be negotiated. Cheng also warns against the slippery slope fallacy, which exploits these gray areas. The slippery slope argument says, if we allow X, we will inevitably end up allowing Z. If we allow gay marriage, next people will marry their dogs. This argument relies on the idea that because there is no sharp line, we will slide all the way to the bottom. Logic tells us this is false. Just because a line is fuzzy or artificial doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We can draw a line at human adults and stop there. We are capable of stopping on a slope. In summary, this chapter teaches us to forgive the fuzziness of language.
We must stop demanding that words like fair, strong, or good have the precision of triangle or prime number. We must accept the gray and take responsibility for where we choose to draw our lines.
Chapter 13. Analogies. If logic is the skeleton of thought, then analogies are the connective tissue that helps us explain that skeleton to others. We use them constantly. We say, the heart is like a pump, or the atom is like a solar system, or budgeting for a country is like budgeting for a household. Eugenia Cheng loves analogies. As a mathematician, she views mathematics itself as the ultimate study of analogies. However, she warns that in the public sphere, analogies are often the site of the most catastrophic logical failures. What is an analogy, really? Logically, an analogy is a proposal that two different things share the same abstract structure. You have situation A, the source, and situation B, the target. You are saying the relationship between the parts in situation A is identical to the relationship between the parts in situation B. When we say a government budget is like a household budget, we are proposing a map. Household income maps to tax revenue. Household spending maps to government spending. Debt maps to national debt. In a household, if you spend more than you earn forever, you go bankrupt. The logic is clear. Therefore, the argument goes, if a government spends more than it takes in, it will go bankrupt. Cheng stops us here. This is where we must test the analogy. Does the structure actually map perfectly? In a household, you cannot print your own money. A government can, usually. In a household, you eventually die and your debts must be settled. A state is theoretically immortal. Because these fundamental structural constraints are different, the analogy breaks. The map doesn't fit the territory. The logic that applies to the kitchen table does not apply to the treasury. Cheng calls this the failure of isomorphism. Isomorphism is a math term meaning same shape. A bad analogy tries to map two things that have different shapes.
The danger, Cheng explains, is that analogies are incredibly persuasive emotionally, even when they are logically garbage. If you compare a political leader to Hitler, you are triggering a massive emotional response. You are importing all the horror of the Holocaust into a debate about, say, tax policy or zoning laws. From a logical perspective, you have to ask, does the structure hold? Did Hitler build highways? Yes. Did this leader build highways? Yes. Does that make them analogous? No, because building highways was not the structural core of what made Hitler evil. The genocide was. Unless the current leader is committing genocide, the structural mapping fails. You are comparing surface details, not the core skeleton. Cheng gives us a rule of thumb for using analogies responsibly. We should use analogies to explain, not to prove. An analogy is a teaching tool. It helps someone grasp a complex concept by relating it to something familiar. Think of electricity like water flowing in a pipe. That helps you understand voltage and current. But you cannot use the pipe analogy to prove facts about electricity. If you cut a pipe, water leaks out. If you cut a wire, electricity does not spill on the floor. If you push the analogy too far, it becomes a lie. In our arguments, we must learn to spot when someone is abusing an analogy. When they say X is just like Y, they are making an analogy. Theft equals taking money without consent. Taxation equals taking money without individual consent in the moment. The mapping looks strong, but you can point out the structural difference. Theft provides no service in return. Taxation provides roads, schools, and police. The exchange structure is different. By highlighting the broken link in the map, you dismantle the argument without having to scream. Ultimately, analogies are a bridge between our minds. They allow us to transfer understanding from one person to another. But like any bridge, if you put too much weight on it, if you try to force it to carry a heavy logical proof, it will collapse. Chapter 14. Equivalence. We have discussed how we distinguish things, how we draw lines and create categories. Now, Eugenia Cheng asks us to look at the opposite problem. How do we decide when two different things are actually the same? This brings us to the concept of equivalence. In strict mathematics, equality is a very high bar. For A to be equal to B, A equals B, they must be identical in every single way. They must be the same object.
By this definition, nothing in the real world is equal to anything else. No two apples are atom for atom identical. No two humans are identical. So if we want to build a society based on equality, we have a logical problem. How can we treat people equally if they are naturally different? Cheng introduces the mathematical solution, the equivalence relation. In math, we can decide that two things are equivalent if they share a specific value that matters for our current purpose, even if they are different in other ways. The classic example is money. Imagine you have a $10 bill. I have two $5 bills. Are these objects equal? No. Yours is one piece of paper, mine are two. Yours has Hamilton on it, mine have Lincoln. Physically, they are totally different. But in the context of purchasing power, they are equivalent. We can swap them and nobody loses value. However, if the context changes, say we are at a museum of rare currency, the $10 bill might be a rare print worth thousands, while the fives are worthless. Suddenly, the equivalence breaks. This teaches us a profound lesson. Equivalence is not a fact of nature.
It is a choice of context. Cheng applies this to the thorny social issue of discrimination. When we say all people are created equal, we are establishing an equivalence relation. We are saying, despite our differences in height, talent, biology, and history, there is a specific context, human rights, in which we count as the same. The logical failure of prejudice is often a failure to choose the right context. For example, consider a job interview for a mathematician. Candidate A is a man, candidate B is a woman. A sexist might say they are not equal, men are physically stronger on average. Logically, this might be true, the premise, but the context is wrong. For the purpose of doing math, physical strength is irrelevant. It is like judging the value of the $10 bill by the color of the ink rather than the number printed on the corner. In the context of math ability, if they both have PhDs and good theorems, they are equivalent. Cheng also tackles the dark history of separate but equal.
In the American legal system, Plessy v. Ferguson, it was once argued that you could segregate races as long as the facilities were equal. Logic, and later the Supreme Court and Brown v. Board of Education, destroyed this. Why? Because the act of separation itself introduces a difference. If you have two water fountains and you label one white and one black, you have introduced a hierarchy. The social meaning attached to the separation makes them non-equivalent. Cheng shows us that you cannot have social equivalence if you enforce physical separation because the context of society includes status, dignity, and access. This chapter challenges us to be precise about our equivalence relations. When we debate fairness, we are usually debating which differences should count and which should be ignored. Should a CEO be paid 300 times more than a worker? If your equivalence context is human worth, then no, they are both human, they should be equivalent. If your equivalence context is market value of skills, then maybe yes, the CEO's skill set is rarer, like the rare banknote. Most political arguments are people shouting different contexts at each other. He committed a crime, he should be in jail. Context, law. He was starving and stole bread. Context, morality, survival. Logic asks us to stop shouting and define the context. In the eyes of the law, they are equivalent to other thieves. In the eyes of morality, are they equivalent to a greedy embezzler? By understanding equivalence, we stop looking for identicals and start looking for relevant similarities. We learn to treat different people fairly by focusing on the specific ways in which we are indeed the same. Chapter 15. Emotions. For centuries, Western thought has been dominated by a single powerful myth, the myth that reason and emotion are enemies. We imagine a battlefield inside the human mind. On one side stands logic, cool, calculated, masculine, and strong.
On the other side stands emotion, hysterical, chaotic, feminine, and weak. We are told that to be smart, we must suppress the heart and elevate the brain. Eugenia Cheng wrote this book to tell us that this war is a lie. In this pivotal chapter, Cheng argues that emotions are not the opposite of logic. They are the fuel for logic. If you remember the earlier chapters, we learned that every logical argument must start with an axiom, a core belief that cannot be proven. Where do those axioms come from? They do not come from math. They come from how we feel about the world. They come from our sense of justice, our fear of pain, our love for our families, and our hope for the future. If you strip away all emotion, you don't become a super genius. You become a computer with no power cord. You have the processing power, but no reason to process anything. You can calculate the most efficient way to build a hospital or a bomb, but without emotion, you cannot decide which one should be built. Cheng introduces the concept of logical empathy. Usually, when we argue, we view the other person's emotions as a barrier. We think if they would just calm down and stop crying/shouting, they would see the facts. Cheng suggests we flip this. We should view the other person's emotions as data. If someone is angry, that is a fact. It is a piece of evidence that suggests one of their core axioms has been violated. Instead of ignoring the anger, a logician should analyze it. Why does this specific conclusion cause this specific reaction? This approach changes the way we handle impossible arguments. Let's go back to the example of a person afraid of flying. The rational robot approach is to bombard them with crash statistics. This fails because it ignores the data of their fear. The logical empath approach looks like this. Acknowledge the emotion. I see that you are terrified. Validate the structure. It makes sense that you are scared.
You are trapped in a metal tube, 30,000 feet in the air, and you have no control. That is a terrifying situation. We both want you to be safe. Since we know the feeling of fear is real, but the statistical danger is low, how can we manage the feeling? Notice what happened there. You didn't tell them they were wrong. You used logic to separate the feeling of danger from the reality of danger while respecting both. Cheng also warns us about the gendered trap of emotional versus rational. In society, when a man raises his voice and gets angry in a meeting, he is often seen as passionate or authoritative. When a woman does the same, she is seen as emotional or irrational. Cheng points out that this is a logical error. Anger is an emotion. If a man is angry, he is being emotional. To pretend that male anger is logic and female sadness is emotion is a categorization failure. It blinds us to the reality that everyone is emotional.
The most dangerous people are not the ones who cry. The most dangerous people are the ones who think they have no emotions. Because they believe they are purely logical, they mistake their own prejudices for objective facts. They mistake their own fear for wisdom. They cannot check their biases because they don't believe they have any. Cheng invites us to integrate the two. Be logical about your emotions. Ask yourself, I am feeling defensive right now. Why? What axiom of mine is under attack? Be emotional about your logic. Ask yourself, does this cold, hard conclusion actually serve the human beings it affects? Is this argument kind? Logic provides the rigorous path from A to B, but emotion is the only thing that can tell us if B is a place worth going to. We need the compass of the heart to steer the engine of the brain. Part 3, Beyond Logic, Chapter 16, Intelligence and Rationality. We have reached the end of our journey. We have dismantled the machinery of arguments, explored the paradoxes of truth, and reconciled the cold precision of math with the warm chaos of human emotion. Now, Eugenia Cheng leaves us with a final challenge. How do we live this? To answer this, we must distinguish between two concepts that are often treated as identical: intelligence and rationality. Intelligence is raw processing power. It is the ability to solve a puzzle, memorize a list, or calculate a trajectory. It is the horsepower of the engine. Rationality is something different. Rationality is the ability to use that power to navigate the world effectively. It is the steering wheel and the driver. Cheng warns us that it is possible to be highly intelligent and profoundly irrational. We have all met the smart fool. This is the person who can cite obscure statistics and construct complex syllogisms, yet they constantly ruin their relationships, make terrible life decisions, and cannot understand why everyone disagrees with them. They're using their intelligence to build a fortress around their bad ideas. They use logic as a defense mechanism, rationalizing their biases rather than examining them. This is not rationality. This is intellectual stubbornness. True rationality, Cheng argues, requires a metacognitive step. It requires the intelligence to know when to stop using pure logic. A rational person knows that when a friend is grieving, the correct tool is not a syllogism, it is a hug. A rational person knows that when a political debate hits a deadlock of axioms, the correct move is not to shout louder, it is to stop and ask, why do we believe what we believe? This brings us back to the title of the book, The Art of Logic. Science is the study of what is. Art is the creation of what could be. Logic is traditionally taught as a science, a rigid set of rules for determination. Cheng wants us to practice logic as an art form. Just as a pianist learns the scales, the rules, so they can eventually play music, the expression, we must learn the rules of validity and negation so we can eventually have meaningful conversations. The art of logic means using these tools to build bridges rather than walls. It means using abstraction to see the common humanity in someone different from us. It means using the contrapositive to check our own prejudices. It means using the concept of axioms to forgive people for disagreeing with us. Cheng addresses the historical context of logic. For thousands of years, this field was dominated by wealthy, white Western men. Aristotle, Russell, Frege. They built a system that reflected their reality, a reality of binary choices, clear property rights, and debate as a form of combat. Cheng, as a woman and a person of color in a male-dominated field, offers a new vision. She suggests that logic does not have to be the language of dominance. It can be the language of liberation.
When we democratize logic, when we teach everyone how to spot a false equivalence or a necessary condition, we strip power from the demagogues and the manipulators. We empower the ordinary person to stand up to authority and say, your argument is invalid. The ultimate goal of logic is not to be right. The ultimate goal is to understand. Winning an argument is a lonely victory. It leaves you with your original belief, perhaps slightly reinforced, and an Emmy on the other side. Understanding an argument is a transformative act. It leaves you with a new perspective. You might not change your mind, but you have expanded your world. You have successfully mapped a piece of someone else's reality onto your own. As we close this book, we are asked to go back into the illogic of the world, the screaming news anchors, the Twitter wars, the awkward family dinners, and to bring this art with us. We are asked to listen for the axioms, to spot the emotional data, to draw our lines with care, to be intelligent, yes, but more importantly, to be kind, clear, and truly rational. This is the art of making sense in a world that doesn't. Conclusion and acknowledgements. We have now reached the final page. In the acknowledgements, Eugenia Cheng offers her gratitude to the many minds that helped sharpen the arguments in this book. She thanks her students, whose confusion and curiosity often sparked the best analogies. She thanks her friends and family, with whom she debated these topics over dinner tables, proving that logic is ultimately a communal activity. She reminds us that no book and no argument is ever built in isolation. It is always the result of a network of relationships, a union of different perspectives working toward a common truth. As we leave these insights, take a moment to reflect on the tool you now hold in your hands. You have seen how logic can clarify confusion, expose prejudice, and build bridges across the widest divides.
But you have also seen that logic is not a weapon to be wielded against the world. It is a light to be shined upon it. The next time you find yourself in a heated disagreement, or confused by the news, or struggling with a difficult decision, remember the lessons of this book. Check the direction of the arrow. Find the emotional axiom. Draw your lines with care. And above all, be kind. Because in a world that often feels like it makes no sense, the most logical thing you can be is human. Thank you for listening to these audiobook insights for the art of logic.